Everything: the estate, the maritime logistics empire, and the $42 million in liquid accounts, is to be bequeathed immediately and unconditionally to Mr. Mateo Cruz. As the attorney spoke those words, the room froze. But the true horror wasn't the sum of money. It was the fact that the silent 26-year-old gardener standing in the corner of the library possessed the exact face, jawline, and cold gray eyes of the late billionaire Arthur Sterling as a young man. How could a man who had trimmed the estate's hedges for only 6 months inherit a dynasty, while the lawful family was left with nothing but a lingering scent of poison? The heavy mahogany doors of the library creaked shut, sealing 8 people inside a room heavy with the scent of aged leather, wax, and freshly turned earth. Victoria adjusted her silver watch, her pulse hammering against her wrist as she watched her husband Julian, white-knuckled and rigid, staring at the brass-bound mahogany desk where the family attorney was unbuckling a battered leather briefcase. At 28, Victoria had spent 6 years walking the tightrope of the Sterling family, hiding her own childhood of foster homes and sudden moves behind an immaculate mask of composure, quiet observation, and an archivist's ruthless eye for detail. She knew every creak of this 3-story Victorian manor, every whispered argument behind closed doors, and every financial tremor that threatened to tear her husband's composure apart. Yet, as attorney Hector Vance pulled out a crisp, red-sealed document, Victoria didn't look at the paper. Her eyes drifted to the back of the room where Mateo, the estate's taciturn gardener, stood with wet mud still caked on the soles of his boots. Why had Arthur Sterling insisted, in his final verbal decree 3 days before his heart stopped, that the gardener be present for the reading of a private family will? Julian's breath hitched violently beside her, his fingers biting into Victoria's shoulder as Hector Vance cleared his throat and adjusted his thin, rimless glasses. Julian was 31, a man built on fragile arrogance and mountain-high gambling debts that he had spent 3 years concealing from his domineering father, desperately clinging to the expectation that Arthur's passing would wipe his slate clean. Across the Persian rug sat Elena Sterling, Arthur's 55-year-old sister, her fingers knitting together in her lap as she stared straight ahead with eyes that had remained tearless throughout the entire funeral service. The atmosphere in the room was not one of grief, but of frantic calculation, a pack of wolves waiting for a carcass to be portioned out. Hector Vance unsealed the heavy parchment, his voice cold and devoid of inflection, as he skipped the standard legal preamble and read the core clause that stripped the air right out of the room. When the attorney announced that the entire $42 million fortune and the title to Sterling Manor were passed to Mateo Cruz, Julian let out a strangled, animalistic roar and lunged across the desk, scattering legal briefs onto the floor. But as Mateo stepped back into the shadows, the slanting sunlight caught his left cheekbone, revealing a jagged, crescent-shaped scar that was identical to the one visible in the portrait of a 25-year-old Arthur Sterling hanging directly above the fireplace. So why had no one in the family ever noticed this horrifying resemblance until this very moment? Julian had to be restrained by Hector Vance and the family physician, his face flushed purple as he screamed allegations of forgery, fraud, and treason against his late father's memory. Victoria stood frozen, her eyes darting between the oil painting above the hearth and the living, breathing young man standing near the French doors, who looked less like an employee and more like a ghost summoned from the past. Mateo didn't flinch, nor did he smile. His expression remained a mask of stoic, almost sorrowful detachment, his calloused hands clenched loosely at his sides. Julian turned his fury on Victoria, grabbing her wrist and dragging her out of the library into the dimly lit corridor, demanding that she use her archival skills to dig into the estate's employment records immediately. Victoria's mind raced as she agreed, but her motivation wasn't loyalty to Julian's greed. It was the terrifying realization that her husband's financial ruin meant their shared life was about to implode, and her long-sought stability was vanishing into thin air. As she hurried down the servants' staircase toward the basement archives, she noticed that Elena hadn't joined the outrage in the library, but had instead slipped quietly out toward the estate's glass greenhouse, carrying a small brass key that Victoria had never seen her use before. What was Elena hiding in the darkness of the glass house while her nephew was losing his birthright? The air in the basement archives smelled of dust, mold, and dry paper, a familiar sanctuary where Victoria spent hours cataloging the family's historical records. She pulled open the metal filing cabinet labeled with current staff records, pulling Mateo's application file that had been processed just 6 months prior. According to his paperwork, Mateo Cruz was 26 years old, raised in a municipal orphanage in Marseille, France, with no listed living relatives and a sparse work history consisting of temporary agricultural jobs across Europe. Yet, nested inside the back folder of his file, Victoria found an unmarked white envelope containing a single piece of heavy glossy photo paper that wasn't part of any standard background check. It was a high-resolution photograph of a hospital room, showing Arthur Sterling 6 months ago, frail and hooked to an IV, holding a newborn infant's silver baptismal medallion. The exact same silver medallion Victoria had seen hanging around Mateo's neck during his morning shifts in the garden. If Mateo had arrived 6 months ago as a simple gardener, why did Arthur possess a photograph of Mateo's most prized personal possession before the young man had even set foot on American soil? Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs as she slipped the photograph into her jacket pocket and made her way toward the greenhouse, the heavy autumn wind howling through the estate's oak trees. The glass structure glowed faintly under the overcast gray sky, its panes fogged with humidity and condensed moisture. Stepping silently through the side entrance, she caught the sharp, bitter scent of crushed nightshade and belladonna, plants that had no business being cultivated alongside Arthur's prized orchids. Through the thick greenery, she saw Elena standing over a copper distillation kettle, carefully pouring a dark brown liquid into a small glass vial, her hands trembling so violently that the glass clicked against the metal stem. Victoria held her breath, crouching behind a display of ferns, watching as Elena sealed the vial with wax and hid it inside the hollow base of a stone garden gnome. Before Victoria could slip away, a floorboard creaked under her boot, and Elena spun around, her eyes wide with terror, dropping her brass key to the flagstone floor. Why was Arthur's sister distilling deadly herbal extracts in secret less than an hour after her brother's will was read? Elena didn't scream. Instead, she collapsed against the wooden workbench, her face pale and sunken as she looked at Victoria not with anger, but with overwhelming, pathetic exhaustion. Victoria stepped forward, picking up the brass key from the ground and holding it out, demanding an explanation for the hidden vial and the unusual plants growing in the rear beds. Elena buried her face in her weathered hands, weeping softly, whispering that Arthur had been dying long before his heart finally gave out, and that the house was cursed by a debt incurred nearly 30 years ago. She claimed the liquid in the vial was merely a concentrated sedative she used for her severe insomnia, but her eyes darted guiltily toward the dark soil beneath the bench where several freshly dug patches were visible. Victoria pressed her, asking about Mateo and the resemblance that had stunned the room during the reading of the will, but Elena's voice dropped to a terrified whisper as she warned Victoria to stop looking into the past if she wanted to survive the night. As Elena hurried out of the greenhouse, leaving Victoria alone in the fogged glass room, Victoria noticed something sticking out from the freshly turned soil beneath the workbench, a corner of a laminated leather driver's license bearing Mateo's face, but with a completely different name printed across the top. Who was the man calling himself Mateo Cruz, and why was his real identity buried in Elena's secret garden? Victoria pulled the license from the dirt, wiping away the dark, damp soil to reveal the name printed beneath the photo: Gabriel Sterling Vance. Her jaw went slack as she read the legal surname, Vance, the exact same last name as Hector Vance, the family attorney who had just handed the entire $42 million fortune over to him. Was Mateo actually the attorney's son, or was he a blood Sterling raised under a false name to orchestrate the ultimate corporate takeover from within? Victoria pocketed the card, her mind spinning with terrifying possibilities, as she realized that Julian was entirely unaware that his family attorney might be in league with the quiet gardener. She walked back toward the main house, determined to confront Hector Vance in his study before he left the estate grounds with the signed estate documents. But as she approached the attorney's ground floor office, she heard low, heated voices arguing behind the heavy mahogany door, accompanied by the distinct sound of furniture being violently thrown against the wall. She peeked through the narrow gap in the doorframe, only to see Julian holding a heavy bronze paperweight high above his head, while Hector Vance lay bleeding on the oriental rug, desperately clutching a burning stack of paper in the fireplace. What had Vance revealed to Julian that drove her husband to commit an act of unhinged violence? Victoria burst into the room, screaming Julian's name, snatching the bronze paperweight from his grip before he could deliver a fatal blow to the elderly attorney. Julian was gasping for air, his eyes bloodshot and chaotic, pointing a trembling finger at the burning papers turning to ash in the hearth. He rasped that Vance had just admitted the will read in the library was a counterfeit, drafted 3 weeks ago without Arthur's legal consent, while the old man was heavily medicated in his bed. Vance, choking on blood and smoke, pushed himself up against the sofa, coughing violently as he insisted that he had only carried out Arthur's explicit, desperate orders to protect the estate from a monster. He looked directly at Victoria, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading urgency, as he rasped that Arthur hadn't died of natural heart failure. He had been systematically poisoned over 6 months, and the true killer was currently standing in this very room. Before Victoria could digest the attorney's accusation, the sound of glass shattering echoed from the second-floor master bedroom directly above them, followed by a piercing scream that belonged to Elena. Was the poisoner striking again to clean up the remaining witnesses to Arthur's final secret? Leaving Vance on the floor, Julian and Victoria rushed up the grand staircase, their footsteps echoing through the cavernous hallways of Sterling Manor. They reached Arthur's private bedchamber to find the heavy double doors flung wide open, cold rain blowing in through a shattered balcony window, and Elena lying unconscious near the foot of the massive canopy bed. Resting on the bedside table, right next to Arthur's empty pill organizers, was an open leather journal filled with Arthur's sharp, frantic handwriting, its pages stained with dried droplets of dark liquid. Victoria ran to Elena's side, checking her pulse. She was breathing, but barely, her skin cold and clammy, smelling strongly of the same bitter nightshade extract Victoria had encountered in the greenhouse. Julian didn't check on his aunt. Instead, he pounced on the journal, turning the pages frantically until he reached the final entry written just 48 hours before Arthur's death. As Victoria looked over his shoulder, the handwritten words chilled her to her core. "The poison is in my morning tea, brought every day by hands I once trusted unconditionally. I will sign Vance's decoy will tomorrow, to force the snakes into the light, but if I do not survive, let Mateo reveal the box beneath the nursery floorboards." Why did Arthur refer to his own will as a decoy, and what was hidden beneath the floorboards of a nursery that had been locked for nearly 30 years? Julian dropped the journal, his hands shaking violently as he looked at Victoria with an expression of pure, unadulterated panic, suddenly realizing that the poisoner Arthur referred to was someone with daily, unrestricted access to his private quarters. Julian turned on his heel and bolted out of the bedroom toward the east wing, where the long-abandoned nursery was situated behind a heavy iron-reinforced door. Victoria hesitated for a second, placing a pillow under Elena's head before sprinting after her husband down the dark, narrow hallway of the unused wing. The air here was freezing and stagnant, preserved in a time capsule of dust covers and yellowed wallpaper from an era before Victoria was even born. When she reached the nursery, she found the door already kicked open, the brass lock sheared off, and Julian standing in the center of the room holding an iron crowbar he had grabbed from the maintenance closet. He was frantically tearing up the warped floorboards near the built-in crib, splintering the aged pine with frantic, terrifying strength. As the boards cracked open with a deafening screech, revealing a dark cavity within the joists, a shadow stepped out from behind the velvet curtains in the corner of the room, holding a heavy iron flashlight. It was Mateo, his face illuminated by the harsh white beam, his voice low and completely devoid of the deferential accent he had used as a gardener. Why was Mateo already waiting inside the sealed nursery before Julian had even broken down the door? Mateo didn't move toward Julian. Instead, he pointed the beam of the flashlight down into the exposed hole in the floorboards, revealing a tarnished metal lockbox covered in heavy blue wax. Julian dropped the crowbar, reaching down with greedy, trembling hands to lift the metal box from the dust, his breathing coming in ragged, desperate gasps. Mateo stepped closer, his voice cold and steady as he warned Julian that opening that box would destroy every lie Julian had built his life upon for 30 years. Julian ignored him, using the sharp end of the crowbar to pop the rusted latch, flinging the lid open to reveal not stacks of bearer bonds or bearer cash, but 2 thick folders of medical records and a pair of yellowed birth certificates. Victoria stepped into the beam of light, reaching past her husband to snatch the top document before Julian's chaotic hands could tear it to pieces. As her eyes scanned the top page, a certified DNA test executed 28 years ago by a private clinic in Boston, her heart plummeted into a cold abyss. The document proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Julian was not Arthur Sterling's biological son, nor was he adopted through any legal agency. He was an infant purchased illegally by Arthur and his wife after their own newborn child had died at birth. But if Julian was a purchased orphan with no biological claim to the Sterling bloodline, who was the real child whose death had been faked 28 years ago? Julian stared at the paper in complete denial, his voice cracking as he screamed that the document was a fabrication created by Mateo and Vance to rob him of his rightful place. Mateo reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, faded leather-bound photograph, tossing it onto the dusty floorboards between them. Victoria picked it up. It was a picture of a young woman with laughing eyes and dark curly hair, holding a toddler with a distinct crescent-shaped scar on his left cheek, and standing right beside her, holding her hand with obvious tenderness, was Hector Vance as a young man. Mateo looked Julian dead in the eye and revealed that he was not Arthur's son at all. He was the son of Hector Vance and Arthur's late wife, born out of an affair that Arthur discovered 28 years ago. Arthur had taken Mateo away as an infant, hiding him in orphanages across Europe to punish Vance, while replacing the missing infant in his home with Julian, a child bought from a desperate young mother in a private clinic. Julian stood frozen, his world collapsing around him as he realized he was nothing more than a biological placeholder used to maintain the illusion of a perfect dynasty. But if Mateo was Vance's son and Julian was an unadopted stranger, why had Arthur left the $42 million to Mateo in a decoy will that he knew would trigger a deadly war? The sound of slow, clapping hands echoed from the nursery doorway, cutting through the heavy silence of the room like a gunshot. Victoria spun around, pulling the flashlight beam toward the entrance, revealing Hector Vance standing in the threshold, his face bruised and smeared with blood, holding a small silver hand-drawn pistol leveled directly at Mateo's chest. Vance's face was twisted in a mixture of bitter triumph and profound sorrow as he looked at the young man who shared his blood. Vance confessed that he had been the one who brought Mateo to the estate 6 months ago, under the guise of a gardener, orchestrating the entire plot to force Arthur to return what had been stolen nearly 3 decades prior. Vance admitted that he had slowly slipped Nightshade into Arthur's daily tea over months, not to kill him outright immediately, but to weaken his mind enough to forge the final signatures on the estate transfer documents. But then Vance turned his gaze toward Victoria, his hand trembling slightly on the grip of the revolver, his voice dropping into a soft, terrifying tone of genuine regret. He whispered that there was one final detail Arthur had taken to his grave, a detail that neither Julian nor Mateo knew, but one that explained why Victoria had been brought into this house as Julian's wife 6 years ago. Why had the cold, calculating Arthur Sterling permitted an orphan girl with no money or background to marry into his high society family? Victoria felt a cold sweat break out across her neck as Vance took a slow step forward into the room, keeping the gun trained on Mateo while his eyes remained locked on hers. Vance revealed that 28 years ago, when Arthur bought the unwanted infant to replace his lost child, he didn't buy just one baby from the desperate mother at the Boston clinic. The mother had given birth to twins, a boy and a girl. Arthur could only take one child to pass off as his single heir. He took the boy Julian and left the infant girl behind, where she was eventually handed over to the state foster care system under the name Victoria. Victoria's breath caught in her throat, her vision swimming as she looked at Julian, the man she had been married to for 6 years, realizing with sickening horror that the man beside her was her own biological twin brother. Arthur had tracked Victoria down 6 years ago, filled with a twisted senile guilt, and had engineered her meeting with Julian at the art gallery, orchestrating their marriage so that his true biological heir would secretly return to the estate without ever knowing her real identity. Julian stumbled backward, vomiting onto the wooden floorboards, overwhelmed by the profound, disgusting horror of the revelation that stripped away every layer of his existence. But if Victoria was the surviving twin and the true intended recipient of Arthur's guilt, why had Vance forged the will in favor of Mateo instead of her? Vance stepped closer, his voice rising with manic intensity as he explained that he couldn't allow Arthur's grand illusion to end with Victoria inheriting the fortune, because Vance wanted the Sterling Empire for his own bloodline, his son Mateo. Vance admitted that he had framed Elena by leaving the nightshade residue in her private greenhouse, knowing the police would blame the timid sister once Arthur finally succumbed to the poison. Vance ordered Mateo to take the metal lockbox and the forged papers and step out toward the waiting car in the driveway, promising that together they would claim the $42 million and leave the shattered Sterling family to destroy itself in the scandal. Mateo stood motionless, looking down at the yellowed photograph of his mother, then slowly looked up at Hector Vance, the father he had spent 6 months serving under the guise of a conspirator. Mateo picked up the heavy iron flashlight, but instead of moving toward the door, he took a step toward Vance, his voice cracking with deep, righteous fury. He revealed that he had never cared about Arthur's money or Vance's grand revenge. He had only agreed to work at the estate to find out who had abandoned him as a child, and he had spent the last 2 weeks secretly feeding Arthur the antidote that saved his life from Vance's nightshade tea. If Arthur was being fed the antidote by Mateo for 2 weeks, then whose body had been placed in the mahogany casket at the funeral 3 days ago? Before Vance could comprehend Mateo's words, heavy footsteps thundered up the stairwell, and the nursery door was kicked wide open as 3 armed state police officers burst into the room, their weapons drawn and spotlights blinding the occupants. Behind them stepped Elena, her face pale but her eyes fierce and fully conscious, holding a digital voice recorder that had been streaming every word of Vance's confession directly to the local precinct station house. Vance dropped his revolver to the floor, his face draining of all color as he realized he had been lured into a meticulously designed trap set by the very people he thought he was manipulating. Elena revealed that Arthur had not died 3 days ago. His heart condition had been stabilized at a private medical facility in Boston, thanks to Mateo's early intervention, and the elaborate funeral had been staged by Arthur and the authorities to force Vance and Julian into making their final, desperate moves. As the officers slammed Vance to the floor and clicked handcuffs around his wrists, Victoria stood paralyzed in the center of the nursery, looking at the broken floorboards, the forged papers, and the man beside her who was both her husband and her brother. What was left for a woman whose entire adult life, marriage, and identity had been constructed as a puppet show by a dying billionaire's guilt. 3 months later, the autumn leaves had fallen, leaving the grounds of Sterling Manor bare and skeletal against the gray sky. The legal storms had finally cleared. Hector Vance was serving a 30-year sentence for attempted murder and grand forgery, while Julian, stripped of his fortune and legally divorced from Victoria, had quietly left the state to check into a long-term psychiatric rehabilitation facility on the West Coast. Arthur Sterling had passed away peacefully in a Boston hospital 6 weeks after the arrest, leaving behind a final, legally unassailable testament that dismantled the Sterling maritime logistics empire entirely, liquidating all assets into a public charitable foundation for orphaned children. Mateo had refused every penny of the estate, choosing instead to return to France to work on a small grape vineyard far away from high society intrigue, leaving only a brief letter of farewell for the woman he had briefly known as a silent ally. Victoria stood on the grand stone porch of Sterling Manor, holding a small suitcase in her hand, as the auctioneers placed the final foreclosure tags on the grand mahogany front doors of the estate. She took a deep breath of the crisp, clean air, feeling for the first time in her 28 years the terrifying, exquisite weight of absolute freedom, completely unburdened by secrets, titles, or stolen bloodlines. As she walked down the gravel driveway toward the main gates without looking back, she realized that the greatest inheritance Arthur Sterling had given her wasn't his millions or his grand home, but the painful, liberating truth that had finally set her free to choose her own name. Moral: true identity cannot be bought, manufactured, or inherited through wealth and deceit. The heaviest chains we bear are the comfortable lies we live to preserve a false sense of security, and true freedom only begins when we have the courage to face the painful reality of who we really are. Join the conversation.